Hello everyone, welcome to another interesting and informative session of The Analyst brought to you by Bajiram and Ravi. In today's session, we will discuss 7 important articles as featured in the Hindu and Indian Express for your comprehensive understanding of the current affairs explained to you in the easiest language possible. The topics are as follows. From your analysis section, which actually provides you the much needed and important avenue for daily answer writing practice, in the first topic, we are going to analyze the recent development in the geopolitics of the Middle East in the backdrop of the recent attack by the USA on Iran. Then, in the second topic, we'll try to analyze the suggestion given by today's editorial that we need to revisit the food and fertilizer subsidy as the poverty levels has declined in our country. Then, we'll take up 5 topics in your simplified section where we'll not only try to simplify the news for you but also provide the much important value addition keeping in mind the approaching May 2025. So, stay tuned. On 22nd of June, that is yesterday, United States of America carried out Operation Midnight Hammer, thus targeting Iran's supposed nuclear site and thus giving a kind of a complete flip to the Iran-Israel conflict altogether, where we can actually expect a lot of disturbances in the peace and tranquility in the region of Middle East with the days to come. This particular action taken by the United States of America actually forms an important component of your GS2 paper under the larger theme of policies of developed nation and its impact on India's interest. So let's first start our discussion by analyzing the build-up to the war which has taken place. Yesterday, under the Operation Midnight Hammer, USA basically attacked Iran's 3 supposed and suspected main nuclear strikes. The sites being, for example, Natanz, which is supposed to contain the largest uranium enrichment center of Iran. Isfahan, where it is thought that there is existing a near bomb-grade nuclear fuel. And the third being Fordow, which is considered to be Iran's most critical nuclear site dug deep into the mountain. The US President Donald Trump also described Iran as the bully of the Middle East and warned of further attacks to take place if Iran does not sue peace with the state of Israel. This attack by the USA basically follows an unprovoked surprise attack by Israel on Iran, which took place on 13th of June this year itself under the name of Operation Rising Lion, which according to Israel had become a necessity to kind of counter the imminent threat of rising nuclear state of Iran. Now, many geopolitical experts has actually termed these unprovoked actions by Israel and USA to lay the foundation of the Third World War, considering that Iran itself, under the provisions of United Nations Charter, has sufficient provisions to actually reply back with much serious counterattack. For example, the Article 2 Clause 4 of the United Nations basically prohibits the use of force by any state in kind of considering the international dispute. Similarly, the Article 51 actually provides the state for right to self-defense if they have been unprovokedly attacked by any other state, and that attack is in the nature of armed attack. Thus, to understand this ongoing conflict between Iran and Israel, we need to actually take the help of history. And for that purpose, we'll start with the history of the formation of Israel first, which was formed as a nation state in the year of 1948. The backdrop of which was actually the rise of Zionism in the late 19th and early 20th century. What is Zionism? Zionism is basically a kind of a ethno-cultural nationalist movement which aimed to establish a Jewish state in the region of Palestine to actually kind of establish the traditional right over the land of these Jewish people. And the rise of Zionism was actually caused by the anti-Jewish pogroms. Pogroms, which is basically a Russian word for programs. So in the late 19th century and early 20th century, there were various public sanctioned anti-Jewish protests and massacres which took place across the region of Europe. For example, in this cartoon, you can actually see a kind of a protest, anti-Jewish protest, which took place in Germany as early as the year of 1816, where you can see the common people of Germany actually targeting the Jewish people and attacking them. Thus, this anti-Jewish programs led to the rise of Zionism, which basically translated to the immigration of these Jewish people from Eastern Europe and Russia to their traditional homeland called as Palestine. And this wave of immigration was termed as the first Aliyah. At that point of time, Palestine was actually ruled by the Ottoman Caliph. The same Ottoman Caliph who actually chose to fight along with Germany against the allied powers of France and Britain in the First World War, which took place from 1914 to 1919. Thus, fighting against this Ottoman Caliph, the Ottoman Caliph which is ruling the region of Palestine, UK in the year of 1917, the Great Britain, of which we were also the part of, under the Balfour Declaration became the first global power to actually recognize the right of Jewish people in this region of Palestine. Now the question which might be arising in your mind is that why Jewish people are actually claiming this Palestine as their traditional land? The answer to that lies in the Hebrew Bible or Tanakh, considered to be the religious text of Jewish people, where the first kind of the successor of the God in Jewish religion, which is called as Abraham, and his son Isaac, they were basically kind of promised by the angels of the God that their successors will claim the right over the traditional land of the Jewish people called as Canaan. Canaan at that point of time, remember, in the Hebrew Bible is not described geographically. However, it is written that Canaan is basically the region where the ancient right of the Jewish people or the ancient law which they used to practice called as halakha, that is applicable. And there are various descriptions across various Jewish texts which basically kind of change the meaning of the traditional land of the Jewish people, normally or most commonly recognized as the region of Palestine. Thus, when in the First World War, Ottoman Caliph was basically defeated and the Turkey was about to be dismembered. You guys can recall the Treaty of Versailles and the Treaty of Sevres, which also led to the kind of the Khilafat movement in our country. Thus, under Sykes and Picot Agreement between Britain and France, the British mandate of the Palestine and Transjordan region was created. Syria was under the French mandate at that point of time, and Iraq also fell under the British mandate. The idea was that Britishers were basically saying that the people in the control of this region cannot rule themselves much efficiently, so they basically required the British rule. Now, after the end of the Second World War, which took place from 1939 to 1945, when the horrors which were committed by the Hitler's Germany over the Jewish people, such as for example the horror of Auschwitz trial, when these kind of things started leaking in the public domain, the demand for a Jewish state in this particular region actually further grew, leading to the establishment of the State of Israel as the Jewish state on 14th of May 1948. And on the 15th of May 1948, this independent state of Jews or Israel was actually attacked by the surrounding 5 Arab countries, leading to the first Arab-Israel or Palestine war. So this was basically the reason, the armistice line which was basically created by the Israel, of which the West Bank was actually occupied by Jordan and the Gaza Strip was actually occupied by the Egypts. At the same time, Syria at that point of time was also in the control of this particular region of Golan Heights. Thus, the major change in the Israel frontier actually took place in the Six-Day War of 1967, in which in the span of 6 days, Israel ended up defeating Jordan, Syria, Egypt, and kind of extended the regions of Israel across the region of Palestine, thus including Golan Heights, West Bank, and your Gaza Strip, your complete Sinai Peninsula, and reached almost to the Suez Canal. You guys can see here the East Jerusalem. So Israel basically kind of added the East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem and declared that to be the capital altogether. So when we have understood the establishment of Israel, the idea is that don't you guys are wondering that in all of these conflicts, where is Iran? Was Iran also fighting Israel at this point of time in all these Arab wars? The answer is absolutely no. Because till the year of 1979, before the Iranian Revolution, Iran and Israel were actually kind of close collaborators. Because at that point of time, from the year of 1941 to 1979, there was government of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi or the Shah of Iran, who was a close ally of the Western liberal democracies as well as United States of America, who basically introduced kind of white revolution in Iran altogether, where he basically planned to modernize the industries by the nationalization of them, brought land reforms for the present, brought profit sharing for the industrial worker. Under the sale and the purchase agreement of 1973, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi basically kind of established complete control over the petroleum industries. And all of these efforts of modernization of industries basically led to the Iranian national income increasing by 473 times. And thus, Iran at that point of time by USA was actually considered to be the counterweight to USSR and close ally of Western Bloc. However, the things changed in the year of 1979 with the rise of Islamist cleric Ruhollah Khomeini, where he basically alleged over Mohammad Shah Reza Pahlavi that the US companies are taking 40% of the profits from the petroleum under this sale and purchase agreement of 1973. Also, he basically was charged for the authoritarian rule of the secret police SAVAK, which were basically kind of trained by the CIA and MI6 at that point of time. And these SAVAKs basically kind of ensured any kind of curbing of freedom of speech and expression. So if there was any kind of dissent which was raised against the government of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, that was basically curbed down. Also, Iran at that point of time was charged under Mohammad Reza Pahlavi to nothing but becoming the regional policeman in the Gulf for the USA. This is basically called as the Nixon Doctrine. What is Nixon Doctrine? So when USA started indulging in various warfare, such as for example stopping communism in the region of Cuba, Colombia, Bolivia, etc., and at the same time fighting the Vietnam War, the USA came to this realization that they cannot ensure peace or the kind of spread of democracy or spread of capitalism all across the world by themselves. So they cannot fight various wars at various fronts. So for that purpose, they actually need certain regional policemen to actually kind of ensure their interest in those specific regions of the world. For example, creation of Germany in Europe, or for example, your Japan and South Korea in the region of Indo-Pacific, the extension of which is the Quad currently, which they have formed, including our country as well. The same purpose at that point of time was actually being served by Iran to kind of curb the spread of the socialist doctrines in the region. And this actually led to the major civil rebellion to protect the socialism and the tenets of Islam by Ruhollah Khomeini, thus leading to the establishment of a theocratic state of Iran altogether, based upon the doctrines of Islam. So what is the US's interest which still prevails in the region? The first was obviously to kind of curb the theocratic rise of the Iran as an Islamic state, where Islam or Iran basically protected itself to be the leader of the Shia Muslims and started indulging or interfering in the politics of Libya, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, etc. Also, it basically tried to free the region of Palestine from the control of Jews or Israel, and thus to free the region of Western Bank, Jerusalem and Gaza Strip from the control of Israel. For which purpose it basically fought Intifada wars from 1987 to 1993, which only got stalled in the year of 1993 through the signing of Oslo Accords between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, again which was mediated by the USA at that point of time. Thus, after that, the Iran basically kind of indulged in the proxy warfare with Israel by creating axis of resistance or creating funding, providing technological support to various military groups in the region, such as for example Badr organization in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza and Houthis in Yemen. The Houthis attack in the region of Red Sea on Indian ship, you guys might have heard about that, very frequently appearing in the news. So when this axis of resistance was created by Iran, basically the Israel's response was the extension of the Nixon Doctrine, where it basically launched a kind of an Operation Octopus, where it said that instead of attacking the various heads of the octopus or the various tentacles of the octopus, it is very important to attack the head of the octopus altogether, that being Iran. Idea is that basically Iran at that point of time earlier was considered as the kind of the regional policeman. The same power or the same authority, the same role was now passed to Israel. And this basically formed the idea of Woodrow Wilson and Harry Truman. Woodrow Wilson, as early as in the year of 1919 as US President, had basically commented that we need to create a strong Jewish state in Middle East to counter the growing socialism and communism in the region. And this was seconded by Harry Truman, thus making USA in the year of 1948 as the first country in the world to actually recognize the existence of Israel, where Harry Truman basically said that we believed in the idea of Jewish state before its formation, and so do we believe now as well. The major support to Israel in this particular region actually came after the Six-Day War, where Israel ended up defeating 5 Arab powers, thus basically kind of showcasing its technical prowess in the region, its regional military superiority. And remember that in this Six-Day War, it basically ended up defeating 2 USSR allies at that point of time, being Syria and Egypt. Thus, US drew up closer to Israel, making it a kind of a regional policeman after the Six-Day War of 1967. Similarly, also remember that Syria and Iran were two major supporters of the Russia in the region. Now in Syria, there has been a regime change where Bashar al-Assad has been kind of removed by USA in the year of 2024. So now there is a kind of a USA friendly government which lies in Syria. Thus, Iran basically remains only power in the region which has kind of support to Russia at this stage. Thus, the USA's aid to Israel has increased multifold, providing $158 billion in aid since year of 1967. Remember that 3.8 billion military aid is provided per annum by USA to Israel, which basically forms 16% of their total military budget altogether. Even if you guys read about the much famed Iron Dome, kind of the missile attack defense system by Israel, that was also kind of funded by USA altogether. At the same time, the two-way trade between Israel and USA exists to be around $50 billion. Also, USA at many stages has actually used its veto power as a permanent member of United Nations Security Council to kind of counter any UN resolution which affects the interest of Israel. Another major aim of USA to curb down Iran is Iran's nuclear program altogether. The start of which is actually quite funny, as in the year of 1967, USA itself provided Iran with research reactor under the Atom for Peace program. And before that, in the year of 1958, Iran had already joined the International Atomic Energy Agency. Further, in 1970, it ratified the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, which we have studied. However, after the installation of Islamic Revolution and anti-Western Islamist government, the stand completely changed altogether, where by the year of 2002, the secret nuclear sites under Natanz and Arak were actually exposed. And in 2006, the International Atomic Energy Agency referred Iran to the UN for non-compliance, where Iran was found to be enriching uranium up to the weapon grade. The UN further expanded the sanctions, banned various nuclear-capable ballistic missiles altogether. And USA basically started pressurizing Iran and by the support of the various world powers to kind of agree on a preliminary nuclear deal, which was signed in the form of Joint Cooperation Plan on the kind of the Armistice on Iran at that point of time, or JCPOA, signed in the year of 2015, where Iran basically kind of came under the verification and the kind of the security alliance of the IA altogether. However, in 2018, under the Donald Trump's regime itself, US withdrew from the nuclear deal and started sanctioning Iran under CAATSA, the burnt of which was actually kind of borne by our nation as well, with complete closing of the Chabahar port which we were developing in the region of Iran. In 2019, Iran announced that it will no longer honor the restrictions under the deal. And in 2022, the negotiations further stalled as Iran advanced the enrichment activities. So this nuclear program of Iran is also a kind of a big major role contributor in this Iran-Israel conflict which is taking place. And what will be the impact of this war? First of all, let's try to analyze that on the geopolitical pillar. The first and foremost is that obviously it will strengthen the Israel-US relation, because this is kind of the first complete demonstration of support by the US at the international level, where it had kind of provided military aid to Israel altogether. Second is that obviously it leads to the divergence from the Trump's political agenda, because when he was fighting the US presidential election, he basically commented that the great power of the world cannot indefinitely fight regional wars. And that was the reason that why USA completely withdrew from the region of Afghanistan, leading to the establishment of the government of Taliban. However, completely diverting from that politics, now the USA has indulged itself into the regional warfare. The third is that the kind of the attack which has been kind of executed by B-2 bombers without any or unchallenged by the kind of the Iran's airport authorities, it basically showcases the weakened military of Iran altogether. And at the same time, when we're talking about the kind of the retaliation attack which can be taken by the Iran under the Article 2 Clause 4 of the UN Charter, it basically kind of revives the ghost of Iraq, where there was an invasion in Iraq by USA. Again, many people say that Iraq was falsely charged that it was holding the weapons of mass destruction. And all of this will further deepen the turmoil which already prevails in the Middle East. And this is going to have a significant impact on our country's interest as well. For example, the trade, as the closing of the Strait of Hormuz recently announced by the Iran altogether, that will impact the bilateral trade which we have with Israel of around $10 billion. Very recently, the companies of our country like ONGC has kind of procured exploration license in the regions of Tamar and Leviathan gas fields. It will also impact the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, through which India was basically trying to reach to the Eastern Europe, bypassing the China's Belt and Road Initiative. The ports like, for example, Mundra and Mumbai in our country, leading to Jebel Ali in UAE, Riyadh and Harad in Saudi Arabia, Haifa in Israel, and ultimately Piraeus in Greece. Also, India and Israel forms the kind of the part of the various important trade and security blocks, like for example I2U2, which basically stands for India, Israel, UAE and USA, a regional block in the region of Middle East. The I4F fund, which was basically launched to kind of provide boost to the innovation in the various emerging technologies. Also, India and Israel contains a joint working group on counter-terrorism, and there are approximately 9 million Indians who work in the region of Middle East, all of them which are actually going to be affected. You guys might be kind of listening about a initiative which has been launched by the India to evacuate the Indians who are living in the region of Middle East. Can anybody name that in the comment box? Similarly, very recently we also read about the economic importance of the Strait of Hormuz, which is going to be closed by Iran now, which basically lies between Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, the basin countries being Oman, Iran and UAE, from where 25% of the global oil consumption and 33% of the natural gas passes. India, which is 85% dependent on the import of the oil, the strait itself contains for 40% of our crude import and 50% of our LNG imports. Thus, we can actually expect the rise of oil prices in our country, which will further increase our logistic cost. Thus, the inflation, specifically the consumer price index combined inflation, is going to shoot up, and that will further dent the propensity to consume of the economy. As the demand will decline, the economy output by the companies will decline as well, and thus the whole chain can eventually contribute to the rising unemployment in our country. So remember all of these important points when you guys are answering this particular question, and we move forward to the next news, where the editorial compares the economic status and poverty level in India in the last 2 decades and suggests for the reforms which shall be taken in the food and fertilizers subsidy, whose increasing cost is actually causing a huge cost on public exchequer and also denting the India's fiscal deficit targets. This issue basically forms an important component of your GS3 paper under the larger issues related to Indian economy. So let's first try to assess the economic status of India from the year of 2004 to 2024. According to the editorial, if we refer to the economic criteria of nominal GDP in the terms of dollar, in 2004 it was $709 billion and it almost jumped 2.8 times in the next decade, and by the year of 2014 it reached to $2.04 trillion, and then it almost again doubled to $4.19 trillion by the year of 2024. India made headlines in the year of 2025 with 100% GDP growth in the 10 years, which actually stunned the world. where, for example, in 2015 our GDP was $2.1 trillion, and by the year of 2025 it had reached to $4.3 trillion, thus a change of almost 105%, much ahead of the change of 76% registered by China and 66% by USA. If we talk the growth of our GDP in the terms of purchasing power parity, purchasing power parity basically kind of compares the two relative economy, where we try to assess the kind of the value which our currency hold when it comes to the terms of purchasing in other nation. So for example, let's say that there is a McDonald's burger and the cost of that burger is $5 in USA. And if the same burger costs 300 rupees in India, then the purchasing power parity between the dollar and the rupees is 60 rupees per dollar. So in the terms of purchasing power parity in the year of 2004, our economy was at $1.75 trillion, increased to $6.45 trillion, and ultimately reaching $17.65 trillion. Keep this in mind that in the terms of nominal GDP, our country is currently the fourth largest economy in the world. And in the terms of purchasing power parity, our country is currently third largest economy in the world. However, when we talk about the per capita income, that is where the data actually starts turning into the abysmal lines. For example, in 2024, with a per capita GDP of $2,424, we were ranked 181st. Then, in the year of 2014, it actually increased to 4,935, making our country 166th rank, and ultimately to $12,131, making our country 149th rank in the world. Even with this significant increase in the ranking, keep this in mind that our country ranks lowest among the G20 countries in both per capita GDP as well as purchasing power parity terms. And in this particular case of per capita GDP, we actually trail behind Sri Lanka and Bhutan in the purchasing power parity terms. So, what can be done to actually kind of improve our indicators in these two microeconomic indicators which we have? What are the steps which can be taken to actually ensure microeconomic stability at the grassroots level? And that is where the largest employer of the working force becomes important as per the editorial today. And that largest employer is nothing but the agriculture, which according to the budget 2025 kind of constitutes for 18% of the GDP and 18% of the gross value addition, employing approximately 46% of the working force with 4% average annual growth. Remember that it can form introduction for any of the answers which you guys will be writing in your GS3 paper, where you can quote that how our country is the largest producer of milk, pulses and jute, or the second largest producer of rice, wheat, sugarcane and horticulture. We are currently ranked second when it comes to the global agriculture production and fourth in the global agricultural exports, with our annual average growth rate of 4.1% at constant prices over last 5 years, where our livestock sector has actually registered a compounded annual growth rate of 7.3%, where 90 lakh hectare has been covered under the micro irrigation, and there has been creation of more than 8,000 farmer producer organizations in our country. So when we are talking about this significant development in the agriculture sector, there were various steps which were taken by our country to actually kind of bring various people from the basket of the extreme poverty. Such as, for example, the article today itself suggests the kind of the initiative of Pradhan Mantri Kisan Scheme, which is a central sector scheme applied by the Ministry of Agriculture, where it aims to provide a financial assistance or an income support in the form of direct benefit transfer of rupees 6,000 to the various land holding farmer families. Families in this context include the husband, wife and minor children, and this 6,000 income support is provided quarterly in 3 equal installments. Also, the article today provides that the fertilizer subsidy which the government provides also kind of reduce down the input cost which is incurred by these farmers. So the government is providing direct benefit transfer to the farmers. The government is providing MSP, where it is ensuring that farmers that we will procure your crops. Obviously, it is not a statutory backing, but yet there are certain crops like, for example, wheat, rice, pulses, which are being procured by the government at MSP. So there is at least a minimum pricing which is providing to their product. Also, to further reduce down the input cost, the government has brought the nutrient-based subsidy scheme, where the kind of the subsidy is provided to diammonium phosphate and muriate of potash. and a per ton subsidy is provided to the manufacturers and importers on the basis of the content of the nutrients in the fertilizer, the contents or the micronutrients which are important for the growth of plant, such as for example nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium and sulfur. What do we mean by per content basis subsidy? It basically means that, let's say for example, nitrogen is the excess of it is actually considered harmful for the plant growth, also for the health of the soil. So the government says that, let's say for example, if the nitrogen content in a kind of a fertilizer which has been manufactured by any kind of producer in our country, if that is less, then we are going to provide you more subsidy for this fertilizer. So if a farmer is basically using that fertilizer which has less nitrogen content, then more subsidy will be provided for that. The idea is to kind of bring down the ideal fertilizer ratio, the use of it, which is actually considered to be 4:2:1 for N:2P:K. Also, there lies a kind of an informal control design, where for example, the Department of Fertilizer, as for the regulation of 2023, has kind of brought a kind of a regulation under which it basically says that we are going to curtail the maximum profit which a particular importer or a manufacturer can produce. This is called as maximum profit mechanism. So let's say for example, the maximum profit which can be incurred by this manufacturer and importers are 5%, and the price of the fertilizer is 100 rupees. Then the maximum price ceiling cannot increase more than 105 rupees. Also, what about urea? Remember, urea is the only controlled fertilizer by the government, where it is also the most produced, used and imported fertilizer. So the government says that, see, whatever is the cost of production or the import minus the actual price paid by the farmer. Let's say for example, the cost of production is 100 rupees and the actual price paid by the farmer is 5 rupees. The remaining 95 rupees which is due to this manufacturer and importer will be completely borne by the central government altogether. Thus, to bring down the input cost which is incurred by the farmers in this fertilizer. Also, because of this lower input cost, because of the income support to the farmer being provided under Pradhan Mantri Kisan and MSP, the idea is that we have been able to reach to this level of production which we were talking about. And this level of production has kind of ensured the implementation of National Food Security Act 2013, where it basically guarantees subsidized food grain to 75% rural and 50% of the urban population under the targeted public distribution scheme, where the eldest women of 18 years or above are actually considered as the head of the household. And the idea is to provide a maximum coverage of subsidized ration to at least 81.34 crore Indians at a meager central issue price. In the case of, let's say for example, non-supply of the food, the state governments has the responsibility to provide food security allowance to this 75% of rural and 50% of urban population. The idea being that because of these three initiatives, we have been able to provide kind of food to the poor at a very low cost, also kind of hand-holding the farmers in our country. But because of this huge expansion which the government is incurring from its pocket, that becomes the major issue. The editorial today suggests that how the food subsidy budget has reached to 2.03 lakh crore and the fertilizer subsidy has reached to 1.56 lakh crore. And this is obviously kind of denting the fiscal gliding path which the government is following, where as per the budget 2025, our current fiscal deficit is 4.8% of the GDP and the government has set a target to bring it down to 4.4% of the GDP by the next year. Because we are kind of providing this fertilizer on a subsidy basis, that is basically leading to various harmful impact as well. Such as for example, these fertilizer, they basically contain ammonium phosphate and ammonium sulfate, which when mixes with the soil and the water, it releases various kind of hydrogen ions. Because of this hydrogen ions, the kind of the pH level of the soil, it declines. With the declining pH level, the kind of the soil, it basically turns acidic. And thus, it leads to the depletion of the essential nutrients, like for example, zinc, iron, folic acid in the soil, which is required for the growth of crops, as well as for the essential bacteria, algae, earthworm, etc. All of which basically hold the soil, and in the absence of that leads to soil erosion altogether. Then, If the kind of the H plus ions are increasing, that will lead to the formation of salt flakes in the soil altogether. Thus, don't you think that the density of the soil will increase? With the increasing density, the root penetration will decline, water percolation will decline. Can we say that the underground water uses by the crop will decline as well, leading to soil compaction and thus reduce fertility altogether? Then, as per a report by the Indian Express, the crops uses of urea or any other fertilizer, the usage efficiency is only 37%. So 63% of the total fertilizer actually drains out in the water bodies, leading to the kind of the harmful chemical algae blooms altogether with high amount of carbon dioxide or, for example, oxygen demand, biological and chemical oxygen demand. That basically leads to the kind of the impact on aquatic life altogether. Also, it basically leaches and contaminates our food crops. So we need to reduce down the fertilizer and fertilizer subsidy. Then there are issues in Pradhan Mantri Kisan, as we discussed in the recent analyst. The issue of existing digital divide. Let's say, for example, you are saying that we are going to provide you this direct benefit transfer on the basis of the land record which you have. But what if there exists inaccurate land record? The payment delay further augments the financial strain altogether. Also, the kind of the 6,000 rupees which you are providing on annual basis, that basically amounts to 1/10 of the production cost per hectare per year. The duplication and the fraud issues remain as well. Just look at the increasing use of urea in the recent years and the crop yield response to the fertilizer, how the crop yield has declined even after the significant use of fertilizer. At the same time, just look at the number of the farmers who receive direct benefit transfer under the Pradhan Mantri Kisan Samman. 65% decline in Maharashtra, 99% decline in Madhya Pradesh between the first and the 11th installment because of the issues which prevail. So what are the steps which shall be taken? First and foremost, to increase, kind of further diversify the use of fertilizer. The government has brought soil health card scheme where we are assessing the farmer's field. And with that assessment, we are actually providing them the ideal N is to P is to K ratio, which is kind of specific to their farmland. Second is to kind of, improving and further kind of prioritizing the use of organic fertilizer under Paramparagath Krishi Vikas Yojana. The third is to create Krishi Vigyan Kendra to provide farmers the kind of information about the soil diversification, crop diversification, use of millets, creation of kind of agroforestry. Then in the case text of PM Kisan, we can kind of link the data with the PM Swamitva scheme, where the land records are being provided to the farmers, to the people in the rural area, digitized land records. Second, we can link the Aadhaar card, know your customer data altogether. Direct benefit linkage shall be done with the CPI-C inflation to actually increase the amount, to further bring the people much below the kind of the extreme poverty which exists. And ultimately, there shall be inclusion of the landless tenants as well. The editorial suggests that we need to rationalize food subsidy by providing food coupons to buy nutritious food. There shall be digital wallet for at least bottom 15%, which shall be provided 700 rupees per family per month. Then at the same time, we can provide fertilizer coupon to actually kind of plug the leakage and increase the use of NPK ratio. The better the ratio, the higher the subsidy will be taken by the farmer. And ultimately, there shall be identification of the tenant farmers as well under the Pradhan Mantri Swamitva scheme. With all of this, we will be able to kind of bring down the extreme poverty level which exists in our country. So remember, if we refer to the $3 per day basis, the poverty level was 27% in 2011, 27% of the population. Now that has come down to 5.3%. Even if we take at the higher poverty rate, that is $4.2 per day, approximately 300 rupees per day, even on that level, only 23% of our population currently falls below this poverty level. So the idea is that we can further bring down the subsidies which are being provided by the government to actually kind of take the fiscal gliding path. Keep all of these things in your mind. Try to attend these particular questions, and we move forward to the next news, where a major issue has been raised by today's editorial, where it talks about recognizing the Adivasi identity in the census. What does the article say? The article says that census is to be held in 2027 lack the clarity on the promised caste enumeration. But there is also hardly any discussion which is being taken place on the long-standing demand of the Adivasi or the scheduled tribe communities that their distinct identities, including the system of faith, to be recognized as the part of the census. The religions which are mentioned in the census, on which you guys can choose from, is six: Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, Sikhism, Jainism and Buddhism. For those with other beliefs, there is a general column which is called as Other Religious Persuasion or ORP. There is no column for the belief of STs. First of all, let's try to understand what does this scheduled tribe stands for. First of all, there is no definition in the constitution altogether given for this scheduled tribe. They are basically notified under Article 342. So Article 366 specifically says that scheduled tribe basically means to be held as defined under Article 342. Article 342 says that there shall be a special provision for the tribes as the President may notify. A generally accepted criteria for these are basically the tribes who have diversity of language. They have distinct social and cultural organizations. They are economically underdeveloped and they largely face geographical isolations because they basically or largely live in the forested area. Then as per the recommendation of the Debar Commission of 1966, there are considered to be 75 particularly vulnerable tribal groups in our country, which are basically defined on pre-agricultural level technology, stagnant or declining population, extreme low level of literacy and subsistence level of economy. If we refer to the data which has been provided to us by the last census which was conducted in the year of 2011, the number of scheduled tribes in our country was 705. The population of them were around 10.43 crore or 8.6% of the total population. And this total population of 10.43 crore, almost 89.97 or close to 90% were actually living in the rural areas, and their literacy rate was as low as 58% altogether. These are the several major tribal groups, particularly vulnerable tribal groups in various states. Just read them and try to solve this particular question. Moving forward, what are the issues which are faced by this scheduled tribe? The first and foremost is that the modernized development, which is kind of based upon the globalized, homogeneous culture, and that kind of comes in conflict with the traditional culture itself. For example, now even these scheduled tribe people, influenced by the culture which prevails around them, are drinking kind of packaged fruit juice instead of eating the various kind of fruits which are available in their forest. Second is, we were talking about the low literacy level which they had, for example, as low as 58% as by the 2011 census. This actually goes as low as 10% in various tribal majority regions like Singhbhum in Odisha. And that basically leads to what? Low skill accumulation and difficulty of their integration in the workforce. Then they face issue of large-scale deforestation and non-recognition of their rights under the Forest Right Act of 2006 because of the lack of documentation they have. How they will prove that their generations or 3 generations from last 75 years are living in that particular forest area? Or for example, if they are practicing the specific jhum cultivation or shifting cultivation altogether. Then there exists non-recognition of their democratic rights because of their absence from the kind of the parliament, bureaucracy, etc. Of all the people who got selected in this year UPSC examination, just refer to how many of them actually belong to this particularly vulnerable tribal groups. Also, one of the reasons is the lax-sidal implementation of the Panchayat extension to the Scheduled Areas 1996 Act. And the today's article specifically highlights their non-recognition of rights under Article 25 of the Constitution. Let's read about it. The article says that there are various affirmative actions which has been taken by the government and provided by the Constitution for the protection of these tribal people. Such as, for example, the Constitution has a specific protection for the provision for protection of belief, custom and traditions of STs. Such as, for example, 5th and 6th schedule area. So you guys might recall that how we were discussing about the creation of autonomous district council to provide tribal autonomy in the 6th schedule regions, the demand which is being raised by Ladakh. Now there are also articles 371 and 371B which provides for specific protection for customary laws and practices in Nagaland and Assam respectively. Similarly, the Article 25 ensures the right to profess, practice and propagates one faith, and Article 26 guarantees the right to manage the religious affair. But the restriction in the census to 6 religions itself and the ambiguous provision of other religious persuasion category actually violates the spirit of Article 25 as per the today's article. Because the writer of the article, member of the CPI party, says that it compels the scheduled tribe to misidentify the mainstream faith or to be relegated to a catch-all category, where according to the writer 0.66% or approximately 79 lakh of the population as per the 2011 census registered under this ORP, thus making the large majority of ST communities could not register or their religious identity at all, or they were mistaken about it because they don't have that much of knowledge considering the low literacy level and the large scale rural population which prevails. The article basically argues that in the region where there has been taken place organization based mobilization, for example in the region of Jharkhand, 49 lakh people actually under the ORP column wrote their religion to be of Sarna. So basically there are a lot of people who don't identify with this sixth religion. If there is a kind of a mobilization which has been taking place on the organizational level, the people are much more aware and thus they are identifying their religion to be a different one. But because this literacy or this organization level mobilization is very low across the country, majority of the people are unable to understand the difference. There are various steps which has been taken by the government to actually kind of improve the status of tribals beside this argument which we were discussing. So as for example, November 21 is actually kind of celebrated as Janjati Gaurav Divas. 2nd October 2024, the Dharti Aba, considered to be the Birsa Munda, Janjati Gram Utkarsh Abhiyan has been launched. The Pradhan Mantri Jan Man Yojana, which basically aims for Sabko Pakka Ghar, Har Ghar Nal Se Jal, Har Ghar Bijli, Kaushal Vikas or skilling of the tribals as well. For that purpose, the Janjati Darpan and Viksit Bharat Sankalp Yatra has been launched by the government to further sensitize the tribals about their educational rights, to further include them into the workforce. And specifically for the development of this particularly vulnerable tribal group, there is a specific mission has been launched by the Ministry of Tribal Affairs. So remember the issues, remember the steps which has been taken by the government, and we move forward to the next news, where we are going to discuss about the issue of how these foreign higher educational institutions which are going to be open in our country, how they are going to fare and what are the challenges which they face. Let's first start to understand the story so far. Several foreign universities are setting up the branch campuses in our country. So far, 7 universities from the various countries like for example UK, 5 from Australia, 1 from US, Italy and Canada, all of them are in the process of obtaining necessary approvals or have done so already. And most of them will be opened in the Gift City and the Navi Mumbai. While India has been interested in attracting the foreign universities for more than a decade, the National Education Policy 2020 revived it and the government subsequently approved, keep this in mind, the UGC setting up and the operation of campuses of foreign higher education institutions in India regulations of 2023. According to which, these higher education institutions which are being opened in our country now, they need to provide the same level of education which they are providing in the main campus in their country of origin. Second, these universities shall secure position within the top 500 institutions as per the recent global ranking. If you want to open the university in our country and also use the foreign contributions of any kind, donations and all, for that purpose you need to require a permission under the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act of 2010. Then remember that no programs can be offered in online or distance learning modes. But what if, let's say for example, as a student, I want to learn about a specific provision of quantum technology and the best teacher for that is actually sitting in France. So what will happen? And that teacher is saying that no, I do not want to serve in warm country like India, which is having temperature more than 50 degrees Celsius. In that case, yes indeed, 10% classes can be conducted in online mode of the total number of classes, not more than that. At the same time, these foreign institutions have autonomy to recruit the faculty and the staff as well. First of all, why? Why this kind of the foreign institutions actually want to open their universities in our country? What is the purpose of Oxford in the region of Patna, Bihar? The idea is that there started taking place the expansion of the higher education post World War II, where the idea was to accommodate and skill the demographic dividend of these countries first. But with the increasing low total fertility rate and thus declining population in developed nation, it also translated to the falling enrollment rate in the colleges. Now these colleges had already created large physical infrastructure. At the same time, there was cutting down of the public or the government spending on this college as well. So this financial challenge of sustainability which these colleges were facing, that basically led to the admitting the large number of international students. From the year, specifically from the year of 1991 onwards, LPG reforms, you see how many students they started going to the foreign to actually get education from there. For example, by the year of 2023, 22% enrollment in UK universities, 24% in Australia and 30% in Canada were actually coming from our country itself. And that basically led to the concept of brain drain, where according to the Ministry of Education, students who were studying abroad were 5.8 lakhs in 2019 and that increased to 9 lakh approximately in the year of 2024. And why these students were actually going outside? For simple reasons: high quality education, cutting edge technology, improved career prospect, high salaries which you guys will get there, and obviously the better standard of living. Causing what? Causing brain drain. 75% of the students who studied abroad, let's say for example got expert in quantum technology, did not return in our country to make semiconductors, rather stayed there itself, causing a brain drain. At the same time, now this enrollment and the easy visa policy which was existing in various Europe and USA countries, that has started declining because of the rising sun of the soil syndrome. Because these Indians who became skilled, and obviously because of the kind of the talent which we have since our childhood, and that is to do the large scale labor work. So if the company is saying work for 10 hours, we say no, we'll work for 16 hours, right? That is in our blood, thanks to colonialism which we had. So the idea is that because of that, we also started basically kind of occupying a large number of occupational jobs. And that basically led to a large scale native population there which remained unemployed. And thus that led to the rise of sun of soil syndrome, where various universities and countries are kind of making it a bit reluctant to include Indian students. That leads to basically the kind of the various foreign universities opening their universities in our country to further increase their income. And that is basically the kind of the first issue which we are going to discuss, and that is low cost per student ratio. So obviously India kind of offers a huge higher education market with a large number of enrollments. But per student cost is actually kind of very low in our country. Where let's say for example, if you are going to keep the fees 2 lakh rupees a year, that is obviously not or cannot be borne by large section of our population. Just today we discussed that how 23% of our population cannot even afford $4.2 per day. How they will pay this fees? Second is the foreign higher education institutions are basically driven by the monetary interest. So in the case of the absence of large scale admission, it will become very difficult for them to sustain in our country. Then obviously if their fees is so high, they are providing such great infrastructure in our country. In that case, only certain people who kind of fall in the high income bracket can actually avail in these colleges. And that will basically lead to that these colleges will become nothing but the symbol of elitism and will not facilitate the instrument of social justice. Further, the students will try to actually enroll in these institutions to actually get easy visa, thus leading to further issue of brain drain. In various cases, the universities which has opened in the past, they actually lack quality infrastructure and kind of employ substandard faculty. Over and above, they kind of market themselves to be a large scale institution, but they only provide certain specialized products. And thus that lead to creation of diploma mills in very specific sectors, thus not kind of meeting the large scale education demand which our country has. So these are the major challenges. Remember, all that glitter is not gold. And we move forward to the next news, where we are going to discuss what forms a critical tiger habitat. Why it is in the news? Because a plan was drawn up to actually rationalize the boundary of Sariska Tiger Reserve's critical tiger habitat. And that will basically provide a kind of a lifeline to over 50 marble and dolomite mines which were actually closed following a Supreme Court order. These are basically the areas which now has kind of been relaxed from the critical tiger habitat under the proposed plan altogether. The question arises that what forms critical tiger habitat? So critical tiger habitat was recognized under the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 by an amendment which was done in the year of 2006, where the section 38 clause 5 includes the tiger reserve, and it basically says that the tiger reserves includes both a core area and a buffer area. This core area is also termed as a critical tiger habitat, and that shall be having a status of equivalent to a national park or a wildlife sanctuary. Now, is this critical tiger habitat is described anywhere? Remember, it is completely not. Neither in the Wildlife Protection Act Amendment of 2006 nor in the Forest Act of 2006. However, it is actually the definition which is provided in the Forest Right Act of 2006 is of critical wildlife habitat and not of critical tiger habitat. The article only says, the amendment which was in 2006 under section 38, it only says that the tiger reserves, which basically includes this core area, there shall be settlement of scheduled tribe and that will be allowed, but only after the identification of such safe areas by the state governments. The idea is that such critical tiger habitat was kind of created to further provide impetus to the Project Tiger 1973. Which was launched to kind of increase the population of the tiger. When it was started, there were 9 reserves and 1,827 tigers in the year of 1973, which now has been increased to 55 tiger reserves and more than 3,600 tigers in 2023, reaching to an approximate number of 3,682. The states which have highest tiger numbers are Madhya Pradesh, followed by Karnataka, Uttarakhand, Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu. And the reserves which has highest tiger population, the first is Jim Corbett, then there is your Bandipur in Karnataka, Nagarhole in Karnataka, Bandhavgarh in Madhya Pradesh and Dudhwa Tiger Reserve in Uttar Pradesh. Remember that India is home to 75% of the tiger population in the world. The tiger, which has current International Union for Conservation of Nature or IUCN status of being endangered, and to kind of regulate the affairs as well as this critical tiger habitats, there is a creation of National Tiger Conservation Authority, which is headed by Minister of Environment, right? At this stage, a very interesting question to all of you. Tiger forms the part of one of the 6 big cats which we have. And there was also a big cat alliance which was in the news recently. Can anybody name the rest of the 5 big cats? And we move forward to the next news, where we are going to learn about a very important organization in the news called as Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Why? Because our defense minister and our national security advisors are likely to travel to China for the SCO meetings. And this is going to be the first meeting of the defense minister and the national security advisor to their Chinese counterparts since the military hostilities took place between India and our dear neighbor Pakistan, where we basically launched Operation Sindoor in the retaliation to the Pahalgam terror attack. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization currently contains of the memberships, for example, Russia, China, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Iran, India, Pakistan, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. A kind of a acronym which you guys can learn here is RUCA, Ta, China, Ujka, Pain. So these were the original members, and then Iran joined it in 2023 and then ultimately Belarus joined in the year of 2024. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a Eurasian Political, Economic and International Security Organization, established first in 2008 and India and Pakistan joined in 2017. It is a very important organization because it contains of 24% of the world's area, 42% of the world's population and 23% of its GDP. The chief executive body, which kind of regulates the function of SCO, is the head of the State Council. It also contains 2 important things. First, the regional anti-terror structure, RATS. And remember that the official language of SCO is Russia and China. It is not English and the Hindi is not included as well. We move forward to the last news of the day, where we are going to learn about a very interesting concept of antimicrobial resistance. The idea is that animal husbandry basically accounts for more than half of all antibiotic use around the world. And it is actually expected to increase to 2 lakh tons by 2030, up to 53% from 2030. Over the last 70 years, antimicrobial compounds have been becoming embedded in the livestock feed. So such excessive or inappropriate use of antibiotics in this regard can lead to what? Antimicrobial resistance. Where let's say for example, if there is any kind of antibiotic which is being provided to you, your body has already kind of developed a resistance to that. So no medicine actually act in your body to kind of curb down the microbes which are entering into your body. The traces of the antibiotics left behind in the intestinal environments of livestock, it actually imposed selective pressure for the bacteria in the gut to acquire and maintain antibiotic resistance gene. These genes further replicate when they are expelled into the surrounding environment, such as for example soil or water, increasing the possibility of human exposure, especially for those who work in agriculture. The idea is that it has been projected that the number of the death worldwide because of this antibiotic resistance infection is going to be 7 lakh a year in 2014, and it will increase to 10 million by 2050. Thus, the idea is that now people are saying that we should actually kind of focus upon the insect-based diet for livestock. Recently, 40 countries have actually accepted and issued regulation to use insect-based feed for animal, such as for example black soldier flies, house flies, compost worm, grasshopper, small wheel worms, or for example Jamaican field crickets. The idea is that the use of such insect feed is nutritious and healthy addition to the human diet. It is rich in, for example, fats, proteins, fiber, zinc, calcium, iron. And such rearing of insect will also not only emit less greenhouse gas, but it also lower the cost of production, thus it is much more beneficial for the farmer. And because of this, it will actually kind of leave less microbes in the guts of the animal, and thus the AMR or antimicrobial resistance can actually decline. It will also help to increase the food production, because as per the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, the food production shall increase by 70% by 2050 to sustain the increasing population. So keep this effective idea in your mind whenever you guys are writing about the AMR. And with this, we have reached to the end of our discussion today. Do not forget to attempt the questions at the end of the video and test your knowledge. We will meet in a very interesting discussion very soon. Till then, all the very best for your preparation, and thank you.